and welcome to the Grizzled Survivor channel. You might also be viewing this on the Vidocq.pro channel, depending on how you got here. And if you are, welcome. If you're from the Grizzled Survivor channel, you're probably not used to seeing me in front of the camera. But today we're kind of going in a different direction with a topic on the show. Today we're actually here to talk about the subject of industrial hygiene, which is something you don't figure really factors into the post-apocalyptic thing, but you'll be surprised at how much ties into survival in hazardous environments. And my role here today is going to kind of be to guide us through this and to kind of tie it into the subject matter that matters to the people that are watching. But I do have an expert here to kind of guide us through the actual answers to the questions. So why don't you come on over here and introduce yourself. I'll let you have a seat and I'll go take over back over here.
Well, yes, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Greg Marsh. Originally, I was a degreed chemist. I moved from industrial chemistry, where I went to school at Ohio University, who produced its first Nobel Prize-winning chemist in 2009. Since then, I have become, my graduation from there, I have become what's called an industrial hygienist and an exposure scientist. And we're going to create a series of YouTubes to help people address the problems that are in their homes, schools, and workplaces. These problems involve a field called exposure science. Exposure science has nothing to do with sex and everything to do with recovering your lost retirement and your lost lifespan. We live in a polluted world, and that's basically the basis of why we're producing these tapes.
All right, well, I guess the first question we should start with is what makes you qualified to talk to us today about these various questions that I'm going to ask you?
Well, that's certainly an appropriate question because there are a lot of charlatans in this industry. Charlatans are fairly clever in that they will identify a field of study or endeavor that they know very few other people pursue. So when they announce that they're a chemist, for example, and I know 6 that claim to be and aren't, they depend on the average person's ignorance of chemistry to persuade them and deceive them in the fact that they know what they're talking about. We have a list of this. It's available for people who are willing to inquire to our firm, Gregory K. Marsh and Associates, LLC. Now, this also goes as far as, while I'm on the subject, of addressing charlatan regulatory agencies, which are even worse for us and more insidious. Getting back to my credentials, the reason I'm not a charlatan is because I'm degreed in chemistry. I have a minor in math and a minor in physics, which I probably don't deserve anymore, but you're labeled that way from the time you graduate, and I won't claim any expertise in those fields. Chemistry and the degree that you get in it, sadly, for older guys like me, usually involves some form of industrial chemistry. When I got my Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Ohio University, which has recently produced its first Nobel Prize winner from that same department, I might add. That Department of Chemistry in Athens, Ohio, was in fact unable to understand the phrase environmental chemistry. They were laced through the American Chemical Society, the world's largest and oldest scientific society, to do what their primary donors dictated. And who were their primary donors? The worst in the world. Hey, IG Farben, DuPont, Dow Chemical, Diamond Shamrock, you name it. They're all there at the top calling the shots. And if you went to school to study chemistry, they would highly recommend and pretty much pressure you with no alternatives into studying the curricula that they dictated for students wanting to graduate with a degree in chemistry. And unfortunately, at the age of 19, I decided that was probably what I should do. Since then, I've changed horses, so to speak, very greatly. Now, many credentialed people outside of the field of chemistry might be out there that can provide the services that we provide, which are called exposure science. And this is a relatively new term. It's a new branch of the field called industrial hygiene, which we also call real preventive medicine. Exposure science can be provided, those services, by other people. For example, an environmental engineer, that's actually an engineer, could provide these. A health physicist who studies in radiation and radioactivity would be another good bet. An epidemiologist working at a hospital, for example. And there are a few other fields. Environmental biology might be one too. It depends on the leanings of the scientist providing his services as to whether or not they're qualified and trained and educated to do the work that needs to be done to go into a built environment, people's homes, schools, and workplaces, to ascertain by identifying and quantifying levels of chemical, biological, radiological, and physical problems that shorten people's lives and retirement. And this is what the field of exposure science is really all about. It involves many things, including architecture, design, sometimes engineering, even though we don't provide those services, and those services and their provisions are a conflict of interest. The true exposure scientist will not offer hardware for sale, nor remediation services. What is remediation? Remediation quite often is high-powered janitorial services. It can be remodeling, carpentry, redesign, designing things properly under the instructions of an exposure scientist to prevent and minimize as much as possible future problems of a built environment, usually in an urban area. Suburban areas are the same, and rural areas will have their own set of problems that shorten your retirement.
All right, Greg. Can you tell us a little bit more about your education, your background, your education there?
Yes. Well, for one thing, I am not a PhD. I'm not Dr. Marsh. I'm Mr. Marsh, and my first name is Greg, and that's it. Anybody can call me that anytime they want. It's certainly a lot better than what potentially responsible parties call me after they find out the bad news. As I mentioned, there are other areas of study that can be important, but the ongoing interest of the scientist that is hired for these problems addressed by the field of exposure science, the ongoing activities of these persons that might present themselves for solutions is very important. Technology in the field of chemistry and science and general and industrial hygiene and on and on and on, having safe places to live and work, is evolving very quickly. Now, we all know about the evolution of computers and computer science and computer hardware, but remember, all of that is in fact developments from the field of chemistry. Chemistry is the science of the study of matter. Matter is anything that has weight and occupies space. The camera that we're making this with is a bunch of chemicals. Your body is a living, poorly understood electrochemical cell. Chemists are very relevant to this, especially in a society whose lifespan is falling. Our society here in the United States, for example, is in last place in lifespan and many other important areas, such as cancer and heart disease, among all the industrialized nations of the world. Not only that, we are losing our lifespan for the first time in over 100 years. Chemistry is really the biggest area that is the most important and most pervasive that would account for this dreadful loss that we in America are now enjoying, or perhaps we're not. Nevertheless, People are out there who can do these types of things your doctor will not admit to. Doctors don't know anything about industrial hygiene. They don't seem to even want to, and they don't show up at industrial hygiene functions. A person offering these services will have regular attendance at expos, conventions, and other such gatherings among their peers throughout the country and the Western world that address these newer developing technologies that can add years to our life. Many people think that if they open a window and they have a bad something or other they can actually detect or perceive with their body, they're protecting themselves. Well, we can do a lot better than that. Remember, opening a window is what Julius Caesar did thousands of years ago when he had the same perceptions. We can do much better.
All right, so one thing I took away from what we just talked about is it seems like if someone is a charlatan, they would seem to want to avoid getting reviewed by peers in their field. That's correct?
Yes, that's a really good point to make. Charlatans are never peer-reviewed. I have written very, very few documents that are peer-reviewed. I think 2 or 3 in my entire career. Probably the most peer-review thing that I ever did was be invited by Region 8 EPA here in Denver to write a kernel or a germ of interest in the form of a proposal to create a Clean Soils Act that would complement the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. This was done in 1985, and at the time we had a movie actor in the White House. Of course, this whole research effort that took 2 men, 2 scientists, 3 months each to generate with marginal peer review went away when this was offered to the folks in Washington, D.C. Our work was highly supported even by industry as well as academia, health departments, environmental protection people, primarily from Western Europe, Canada, North Dakota, and this country. We had incredible reception for this proposal, but it didn't fly. Well, peer review was underway and it would have supported it 100%. Charlatans, on the other hand, are not selected for this kind of a position, and in fact, they have really nothing to say to me or someone else they purport to be representing. The 6 people that I know who claim to be chemists and aren't never talk about the field of chemistry. Even when I ask them something simple like, where did you go to school and what did you study? What form of chemistry interests you? Now, if they were an attorney, they would be glad to answer those questions as if the same would apply to a real chemist. But they don't. They have nothing to say. And that's your first clue that you're dealing with a charlatan.